Hello and welcome to Property Matters. I'm Stephen Galpin, and today we're going to be looking at the state of the UK property market, and who better to help us with that but Tom Bill, Head of UK Research at Knight Frank. Welcome to you.
Hi, thank you, Stephen.
Good, nice to have you in. And let's start off with something that you can put your crystal ball away for and just look at today. What is the current state of the market? We have a lot of agents in here and we get very conflicting stories actually. Some say they're very busy, some say they're busy but not getting the end results they're hoping for. So what's the fact?
I think the market at the moment is digesting what's happened over the last 3 to 6 months, including an election, a rate cut. I think over the summer period, things have been a little bit in suspension, if you like. Mm-hmm. People have been thinking, well, the election, when it happened, was on the 4th of July, and what that enabled people to do was to effectively switch off early for the summer. Yeah. So I think things sort of went to sleep a little bit earlier than they perhaps would normally do. And as things wake up and the autumn market begins, I think we'll start to get a better sense of how different parts of the market are going to perform. I'm not sure we're going to see a uniform performance across the market. So I think, generally speaking, we've had a market that's been digesting what's happened, but it's largely been positive around rates, which I think will have good impact on the mainstream market.
Okay. Now, is that analysis limited to perhaps, shall we say, the Greater London area plus the Central London areas, or is that something that you observe nationwide?
I think if you were to draw a line at the moment, you'd probably look at lower value and higher value markets. So in terms of lower value markets, the news around a rate cut was obviously good news. More mortgage lenders, I think, are going to start offering mortgages below 4%. And for the mainstream market, I think that's going to help to drive demand, as well as the prospect of another rate cut before Christmas. If you look perhaps above £2-3 million, I think there are many more question marks around, and most of those question marks relate to the budget and what's going to be happening in the budget. So at the moment you have a market, I suppose, that's operating along that sort of dividing line of price.
Would you say an apprehensive market?
Certainly at the sort of top end, what you might call the top end, and that seems to be around the country, so in London and around the rest of the UK. I think people are thinking about what's going to happen. We've had the decision around VAT on school fees, for example, from January. That didn't help that slight mood of wariness that's out there. And I think people are thinking, what next? I'm not sure there's an individual measure that's going to completely knock the market off course, but cumulatively, I think it will start to have an impact on sentiment.
Okay. When you're looking at these figures, how do you band the various sectors? I mean, when you say at the bottom end of the market or the top end of the market, can you attach figures to that? So take Greater London, for instance.
Yeah, Greater London. It does vary from postcode to postcode. You'll not be surprised to hear. You can do it. We can do it on that basis. We can look at, for example, Belgravia versus what's happening in parts of Wandsworth, and there you'll be looking at different sorts of lines where you would divide the market. Broadly speaking, though, when I've looked at sort of above 2, above 3 figures for June, July, and into August, that's where you start to sense that hesitation in the market, because it isn't just about the fact we've had a rate cut. It's more around what the government's going to do around tax. And as I say, there's that question mark still around the budget.
Okay. So if we take again the Greater London market, we've got sort of prime and super prime, which I know you're particularly interested in. So in the super prime market, is that still fairly slow?
It's certainly been slower this year than it has been in recent years. I think part of that is that apprehension you talked about, Stephen. People are unsure what's coming down the line. If you look at the very top end of the market, for example, around what the government might do around non-DOMs, those sort of 70, 80,000 people in the country who don't pay tax on their non-UK income, of course, a very mobile group of people. And if any incoming legislation is too punitive or taken together with all the other tax changes that may happen, if that starts to make the UK look not so attractive, then they are fairly footloose and they may move to other parts of the world, which I think the government doesn't really want that to happen. But often you have these sorts of unintended consequences.
Okay. Now, just before the election, we had the Leasehold Reform Act being looked at by the government, and also the Renters Reform Bill. I understand that the Leasehold Reform Bill in the majority of cases went through and is waiting to be enacted, I suppose. The Renters Reform Bill got put on the back burner.
Yes.
Have we actually seen any action, any movement towards reinstating or confirming these bills from the new government yet?
Well, I think the Leasehold Reform Bill is probably going to depend on the government's bandwidth and how long it takes it to get around to looking at it again. I'm sure it's on their agenda. The Renters Reform Bill, I think there was a lot of work done up to the point which it did sort of slip away out of the parliamentary timetable. I think we only know two things at the moment. We know that the Labour government is going to resurrect the Renters Reform Bill. It's going to have its own version. And the second thing we know is that Labour have been talking tougher on landlords than the Conservative Party have been. So I think if you look at what they could do, they could make evictions harder, the abolition of so-called no-fault evictions. They could introduce tougher rules around EPC requirements for properties that are being let out. That's certainly what's been spoken about so far. So you could have a situation where landlords have been sort of wary of this succession of red tape and tax changes that have happened over recent years. If more starts to come through now, and there's a question mark about when it's going to stop, I think you could see more of them leave the sector.
I'm always a bit puzzled with this, because in the late 80s, when assured short-hold tenancies were created, they were created for the specific purpose of encouraging people into the property ownership market to rent out, which helped the housing crisis that was there at that time. And it worked. If prior to that, that type of lease coming in, you rented out your property and it had gone. That tenant was there for as long as they wanted to be. So that made a welcome change. It made owning a property for rental, sensible, serious, and also flexible. But we seem to be going back to that, don't we? Back to those pre-assured short-hold tenancy days when, a tenant takes the property and as a landlord, you're stuck with that tenant for life. And I've never understood why a government would want to backtrack on that. And more importantly, I don't see what the problem is in creating a lease which reflects what the landlord wants to do. Now, it might be that you have a 1 year assured short-hold type lease, a 5 year longer lease, or a 10 year even longer lease. But nobody seems to get to grips with this, do they?
No, I think what you've had is affordability has become quite stretched over the last sort of 10 to 15 years. As an issue, it's become highly politicised. It's sort of front and centre of what the Labour Party plan to do in terms of the 1.5 million homes they plan to build. And housing in general has become a topic that is it's a live issue. And so governments reach for solutions that may not have actually the best outcome in terms of the result for the property market. So in the case of the Renters Reform Bill, if you start to disincentivise landlords, ultimately what that does is to push up rents because supply starts to fall. So I think you've had sort of a little bit of short-termism that's crept in. Landlords have been an easy target from politicians of all sides, but actually the rules of supply and demand will tell you that fewer rental properties equals higher rents, and it's going to be the tenants that ultimately pay the sort of financial price.
Yeah, I've often thought some of the tax changes, for instance, that have come in to hit landlords, I think in some ways are quite welcome. I do appreciate that the government are trying to encourage landlords not to be sole traders or what they call accidental landlords, but actually form a company and treat it like a proper business, primarily because the government can collect its taxes far more easily in that sort of scenario. But I do think we have to be careful not to make the rental market so hybrid it just does push up rents higher and higher and higher. And again, this business of insulation and energy efficiency, it's very difficult. I'm not sure that the government is always that competent that it knows what it's doing. I mean, look, we had a whole village that was changed to go over to hydrogen fuel for the kitchens, and then somebody realised, I think they're going to be sitting on a hydrogen bomb or something. So that idea has been scrapped, and yet a lot of money has been spent on it. We've seen the government pull back from legislating about insulation, which Rishi Sunak just cancelled at a moment's notice, even after a lot of landlords had sold their portfolios because they knew their buildings wouldn't ever come up to standard. So I think we're in for very difficult times in the rental market, and I'm very nervous that Labour, if they don't understand it properly, we'll make some mistakes here, and again, it'll be the people wanting to rent properties that pay the price.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think demonising landlords is not the answer. A sort of a headlong rush to net zero perhaps also isn't the answer. I'm sure that'll be a running debate that we have over this Parliament and the next. But as you say, we will look again at our forecasts on the other side of the budget, bearing in mind what the government does around the rental reform bill, because it may well be we need to put our forecast up for what happens to rents.
Okay, well, you walked us nicely into that one. So for the last minute of this half of the show, looking towards the autumn budget, what would you like to see in there?
I think moderation is probably the key word. There can be a tendency from governments to swing sort of too far once a particular sort of set of legislation has been pursued by a former government, and they can sort of tend to swing too far the other way. I don't necessarily think that the property market itself needs a huge amount of focus in terms of what might be coming down the line. We've had a lot of changes in recent years. Stamp duty seems to be the lever that they tend to pull quite readily. I think something around perhaps some sort of stamp duty relief for downsizing would make some sense. So small measures, I think, small tweaks that would actually change people's behaviour and would benefit the market.
You know, one of my favourite subjects is stamp duty, and I thought for many years it would be far better if the vendor paid the stamp duty. Why? Because it would be able to be funded by the purchaser, which it isn't at the moment. So it's another block in somebody getting onto the ladder. People say, oh, no, that's not fair because I've already paid stamp duty coming in. But that's easy. You just say, well, you pay the stamp duty going out less the amount you paid coming in.
Yeah.
Very easy. And I think that would be a tremendous help to the market, but it wouldn't penalise anybody. It wouldn't make it even harder to get onto the market. And I think that's going to be the issue.
Yeah, it seems very logical. Like much of the tax system, I suppose you wouldn't design it from scratch.
No.
What currently is in place, you would have the rethink, but it's the bandwidth and the time that you need to do that. It's not a perfect system at all.
I think so. And on that happy note, we'll go to a break. So join us again after the break when I'll be asking Tom to look further into the future. Hello and welcome back to part 2 of Property Matters. I'm Stephen Galpin and I'm joined by Tom Bill, Head of UK Residential Research at Knight Frank. Welcome back, Tom. So for the second half of the show, I want to ask you again a bit more about the budget that's coming in October, and I'm a little bit worried when I hear Mr. Starmer saying that things are going to be painful. Do you think that's going to relate to the property market?
Yes, he's very candid around that, wasn't he? The truth is, obviously, nobody knows at all, really, what's coming in the budget.
I wonder if they do.
Well, you can speculate about that. I think, they've ruled out the sort of VAT, income tax and national insurance rises. So what that leaves, obviously, are things like capital gains tax, inheritance tax, pension tax relief, all of those things that I think could affect people's sense or sentiment around what they're going to do. There are many people who have probably also seen, or a certain section of the population who've seen, their school fees increase, and now they're going to be having to take decisions around, is it the holiday, is it the house that we move into? So people after the budget, I think, are going to have to reassess a little bit around their priorities, and it may be that the housing market or people's decision to move or not comes into that thinking. So I think particularly at the top end of the market, and we spoke about what the top end is, but so let's say above £2 million around the country, then I think that will become more of an issue. Within the sort of more the mainstream market, what most people understand as the mainstream market, I think the fact that interest rates are coming down is probably going to help the market, and I think we will see minimal price growth, not a lot, but a bit of price growth, and I think we'll see transaction volumes pick up a little bit as well.
Yes, I suppose the question of interest rates, it depends when you were born and what you've been through. I mean, I lived through a period of it going up to 15% at one. I can remember sitting in a developer's office and it going from about 7 to 15% in an afternoon. And boy, was that terrifying.
Wow.
But, you know, today's young people are used to sort of 1-2% mortgages, and that's just not realistic, is it?
No, it's, well, people talk about the new normal for interest rates. Anybody over 35, 40, it'll look a lot like the old normal as we get up to sort of mortgages starting with a 3, starting with a 4. I think that's true. I think we've had I think the banks probably the stress testing rules that were introduced after the financial crisis largely did their job. So we haven't necessarily seen this wave of foreclosures as people roll off of those more favourable deals, which they will continue to do. But I think what it'll mean is that as people do roll off a mortgage that starts with a 1 and roll onto a mortgage that starts with a 3 or a 4, it'll just kind of keep things in check a little bit. So I don't think we'll see waves of foreclosures and arrears, but I think it'll just keep a lid on prices.
When you talk about foreclosures, is it your understanding that banks have been helpful, shall we say, that's probably the best word, helpful in helping people with this transition to new rates? Have they been understanding? I
think that's right. I think they have been understanding. So you combine that with the fact that the stress testing rules have worked largely, and you combine that with the fact that actually wage growth has been pretty good over the last couple of years, and I think all of those things have combined. And actually, the other point that people often forget is the more people own their home outright than with a mortgage in this country, which surprises a lot of people to know. But again, that ownership model has changed over the last 10 years. So if you go back to 2012, for example, more people own their home with a mortgage, but it's the other way around now. So I think all of that's helped.
But where does that statistic come from? Which sector of the market? Is it the fact there are so many less younger owners now?
I don't know around the age band, but in terms of ownership, the sort of structure of the market, you look at the rental market's grown slightly. The people that are owning their property with a mortgage, people that are owning their property outright, they've moved around slightly in recent years. And what happened around, I think, 2014, the number of people who owned their home outright overtook the number who owned their home with a mortgage.
But I think that would be because there's a lesser number of young people that own their home outright, and it then leans towards the older generation, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, got it. Okay, so where do you see the dangers in the forthcoming budget? For instance, what would an increase in stamp duty look like? Where do you think they'd hit with that?
Well, if they were to increase stamp duty, it depends at sort of at what point they did it, if they did it for the whole market or a certain section of the market. Stamp duty changes have been the one thing guaranteed to pretty quickly affect behaviour over the last sort of 10 to 12 years. Help to Buy, all the other schemes that have come in, they have affected what the market's done, but stamp duty seems to be the one thing that quite quickly affects people's behaviour and affects transaction volumes, affects prices. I can't see that they would increase stamp duty. It may be that they keep an initial pledge made by the Tories to keep the nil rate band slightly higher than it has been, rather than let that drop back to its original level, which would help first-time buyers to some extent. I don't sense that they're going to tweak stamp duty, but at this side of the budget, we don't know.
Well, if you do anything to slow the market down in any direction, you'd be sort of between the devil and the deep blue sea, aren't you? Because if you cut down the number of transactions, okay, that may to some degree cut down inflation in property, take the steam out of a market, it may do. But of course there's a knock-on effect, isn't there? You don't sell as many fridges, as many sofas, decorating stuff, DIY. So it does have a knock-on effect, whatever you do. And then if you let the market rip, then you have housing inflation. I mean, I think there's a lot of things the government could do. I'd personally like to see a stop of buying off plan and buying for speculative purposes. I mean, if I take a simple example of that, we had it down here in Docklands. So somebody buys a flat, let's say for £1 million, okay? Then what happens? A couple of years later, there's a development a little further down the road, and for the same sort of flat, off plan, they're wanting 1.2, 1.3 million. So what does the guy in the first building say? Oh, well, that's what my flat's worth then, so I can put mine on the market for that. And you've already had a sort of 30% inflationary rise, in theory, in the price of the building. And I think that's the sort of thing that needs to be avoided. And I think it's the sort of thing Labour need to be very, very careful of if they sort of clamp down in one area and then take the shackles off in another area. Don't know what you think.
I think that's right. I think it's all these secondary effects that sometimes politicians don't think about or are advised about, warned about, ignore. So that's why I think we'll be watching pretty closely what they say, what they do in the budget. And yeah, I think most people are hoping for some sort of perhaps nothing too dramatic that's going to necessarily have all these unintended consequences.
Yes. I mean, it's a little bit like trying to sort of subtly force people to downsize when they don't need a big house and all this sort of thing. I really don't like that. I really do believe that the market can find its own levels, its own paths. And I think that's important to let that happen. And if you try and push against the trend or what people really want, it usually goes wrong, doesn't it?
I think that's right. The track record of government intervention in the housing market is not a happy one. And as you say, the market does tend to self-correct and self-regulate over time, as most markets do. Unfortunately, I think we come back to the problem. It's become politicised, and so it's not like car manufacturing or widget making, which is sort of largely left to get on with their own devices. Housing is a different sort of issue.
I mean, I'm just going to come on the business in a minute of where you get your information from, but just before I do that, I mean, it's bizarre, isn't it? Housing is such an important issue in this country, and yet we don't ever seem to have properly qualified housing ministers. It seems to be the sort of job you either get on the way up for a little while or on the way down as a sort of compensatory sort of post, you know. We never get anybody that, to my mind, has really got a grip of it.
Yeah, I think there's an element of truth in that. You look at the revolving door of housing ministers that we've had. I would say, I think, on the other side of that argument is that I think governments do routinely overestimate their ability to affect how much housing is delivered.
That's very polite.
Because that's a nice way of putting it. Yeah. Because this is down to sort of PLC house builders who will build housing where there is demand at prices people can pay, which is largely set by the second-hand market. And the way it's talked about isn't really like that at all. The government's saying, well, we need to do this and we need to do that. And actually, it's not the government or even a branch of government that does it. It's housing is delivered by private house builders.
Well, yeah, I think this does come down to sort of where information comes from, perhaps where the government takes its advice from. And I've often thought, now, before anybody writes in and complains about what I'm saying, I think the RICS is a marvellous institution and has a real function in today's market. But it's not the all-seeing, all-knowing body that people sometimes think it is. And I think there is a difficulty when the government just rely purely on RICS, which they mainly do, to get their information to form strategy for the future. I think it needs to be wider. If you look at a lot of the high street agents around, very few will have an RICS qualified surveyor or participant in the building, but they are at the ground level and at the coalface of the market, and that needs to be taken into account. And I'm wondering how you spread your gathering of information.
Well, I'd like to think we look as far and wide as we possibly can. So we will certainly look at sort of the official data, what's going through the land registry, the HMRC tax receipts, listings data, asking price data. So yeah, if the data's out there, we'll look at it in terms of how we will form our forecasts. For example, we'll look at lots of different economic data, and I don't think there's a particular bit of data that we wouldn't look at. So we try to take everything in the round. We look at our own data obviously as well, which is probably a little fuller, obviously, so we can sort of drill down and look at what's happening in the particular areas of the country that we operate in, and that sort of covers most of the country. So the answer to that is, yeah, if the data's out there, we'll look at it.
Well, I think what you've just explained is probably why Knight Frank's at the front of this particular market in terms of research and letting the public know what it's found. Tom, just for the last 20 seconds of the programme, what advice would you give to both owners and vendors who are trying to read the current market conditions for their either sale or purchase?
Yeah, it's a slightly tricky one. As I say, as summer sort of goes into autumn and things start to wind up again, I think this autumn is going to be better than last autumn, I would say, in terms of transaction volumes, which have been probably running around a fifth below their sort of 5-year average, and prices as well to some degree. So I think things are going to improve. Rates are going to come down. There's going to be good news. There's going to be sort of fairly positive headlines around, I think, borrowing costs and what mortgage lenders are doing from the autumn. But at the same time, I think you've got a large number of people who will be rolling off, as I say, rolling off a mortgage starting with a 1 onto a mortgage starting with a 3 or a 4, which will just keep a slight lid on things. So I'd say things are going to turn upwards and get better, but I think I'll just qualify that and say we're not expecting, we're expecting sub 5% growth across the UK for for the foreseeable future.
No boom for the moment.
Not for the moment, far more boring.
Okay. All right. Well, Tom, thank you very much. So big thank you to Tom Bill, Head of UK Residential Research at Knight Frank. I'm Stephen Galpin. Thank you very much for watching. Join me again next time on Property Matters.